All right, for more on that story, earlier we spoke to eNCA senior field producer Tumaole Mohlaoli about the spate of racist abuse directed at African players this week. Now, Tumaole Mohlaoli is eNCA's senior field producer. Thank you for joining us. Well, Tommy, we've heard it from FC coach Igor Gamola. He referred to his players as things. It didn't stop there. It went on to Coach Willie Sagnol of Bordeaux, referring to his African players as indisciplined and, of course, lacking intelligence. Quite a disturbing week for FIFA, world football, and African football in particular. Does this happen among European ball clubs?
I think it's been happening for the longest while, Richard, and FIFA itself has been struggling. And I say struggling in the sense that FIFA has, for the last couple of years, been really emphasizing the Say No to Racism campaign. Now, if you look at it in that context, FIFA would not be going so large on a campaign to say no to racism. We see this at the continental national competitions like the UEFA Champions League, the UEFA Cups, but we also see this at club level whereby they go out and promote this message. This clearly means and shows that FIFA has identified that there is a key problem with racism or even mistreatment of ethnic players. And it's not only limited to African players, Richard. I can tell you that in Europe, there have been several complaints from players from other parts of the world, like South America. I mean, famously, Diego Maradona even was racially abused in his time in Italy. Other players from the East, players like Nakata, for instance, when he made his move over into Italy from Japan, he was also racially abused at some places. And of course, we know famously Mario Balotelli, who is an Italian citizen and represents Italy, but is jeered because of his African descent. So really, the whole issue of racism is a big problem that FIFA has been grappling with, although the world governing body has been trying, it must be said.
All right. Now, Tommy, I've heard stories of intoxicated fans yelling racial slurs at African players from the stands. But it seems to be a new trend of coaches stepping out of line and abusing racially African players. Why is that?
Well, I have to question whether it's a new trend, so to speak, Richard. I think with the advent of social media, everything is now easily broadcastable to a larger audience. I think before you would have situations where coaches would disagree with players, and you know, when a player is coming, for instance, from Africa, in the past you would hear players complaining about unfair treatment and having to do 3 times the work to prove themselves to coaches, because you must understand that they're coming from a different part of the world, and of course they are displacing locals who are maybe even fan favorites, and therefore they've been dealing with these kind of tensions for the longest while. But now with social media, anything that happens, the whole world gets to become an audience and goes into the dressing room, whereas tensions before could have been managed within the club. But it is concerning that coaches who are supposed to be seen to be the leading characters in clubs, to be leading the players, are being now seen and exposed to be, showing racial or racist-like attitudes. And I think it is important for UEFA to stamp that out clearly and to send a strong message by sanctioning those who have been found to have been participating in this absolutely unacceptable behavior, and sanction them in the strongest possible terms.
Okay, let's talk about some of these African players now. Would you say that these African players are underperforming and so they get racially abused by their coaches? Because I don't understand why a top performer would be undermined in that way by his coach.
Yeah, that is true. I think it's just an issue of frustrations more than anything else. I mean, you'd have to go into the politics of the dressing room to really understand the dynamics. A coach would not necessarily pick a player unless a player is of the standard to be seen to be participating and producing the goods on the pitch. So when frustrations come, I think it might also be an issue of cultural differences and expectations, because the coach is also, you must understand, under pressure from the board of the club to say, look, we've bought this player, we've spent money, why isn't he on? It might be an issue of a player taking time to adjust to different and acclimatize to different environments, different ways of doing things, and the frustration from the coach, because the coach doesn't only have to deal with criticism from the board, the fans are also on his neck. Look, we've got our local lad here. Why aren't you putting him into the pitch? But you've just splashed out millions on a player. You have to give him game time. Otherwise, it looks like the club has misspent. So these dynamics all have to be brought to the table. And I think there has to be some kind of agreement in UEFA and with other governing bodies to say, how do we handle this issue? If it's a case of the coaching staff or the players being taken for, classes, or to try and educate them and to try and really help them express their frustrations so it doesn't end up boiling out in such a way. Interestingly enough, I do not think that Africa itself is immune to this issue. On the issue of what so-called, ethnic racism, if you will, it's not foreign to African leagues. We get players here in South Africa, for instance, who come from other leagues and are abused based on where they come from. And these are African players, dark-skinned African players, who are being abused racially, if you will, or based on which area they come from, by black South African soccer supporters. So this issue becomes an issue of territorialism. And I think that is also an unreported or underreported story that needs to have its focus lifted, and for CAF to address that, because once you remedy the issue in Europe, what's good for the gaggle is good for the goose.
All right, let me ask you this, Tommy. You've played football. You're a former player. What happens to the player-coach dynamic and team chemistry after such an incident?
I think it disrupts the dressing room to no end, because a player will then feel really hard done by. Once an issue of racial abuse or any kind of abuse enters the fray, the player has got every right to think any decision that goes against him is based on some kind of prejudice and nothing to do with his ability, even if the player is not performing. Therefore, when that comes into the fore, it's very difficult to manage, and therefore I think it's an issue that has to be addressed at board level. And you haven't seen, it's not without precedents where players walk out of clubs because they feel, I'm being hard done by. But it's very difficult to be referee and player in the same situation. You can't look at your own performance and say, I'm performing or underperforming, because everyone sees themselves as doing the best they can, especially at that level.
Thank you for your insight and analysis. That was Tumaole Mohlaoli, our eNCA senior field producer, speaking on racism in European football.